Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about the latest deal with our sponsor, which is the Great Courses Plus, which is a app created by the teaching company and the Great Courses. Now, instead of purchasing individual courses and grinding through all 20 lectures or 30 lectures or whatever, I've created 2 courses myself. Along those lines, now you can buy through the app, you can subscribe to the program and listen to any lectures you want, thousands and thousands of lectures from lots and lots of different courses. You just tap on the app, it opens like that. And like, for example, I was just listening to a course on my George Orwell lectures. I was listening to a course on geography. Understanding Cultural and Human Geography. And here's a lecture I'm halfway through called The Problem with Geographical Determinants. It starts off like that. And it's great because, sometimes I get interested in a course and I want to listen to all the lectures. Sometimes I get bored and I want to try somebody new, or I just bounce around, and that's the beauty of it. So much like other systems, the subscription system is great for that because you have just this rich menu of options. So please go to our sponsors here. The deal is you get a free access to all the lectures for a certain period of time. If you do it through our website, which is the setup for our sponsor here, thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. So to get your free trial to the Great Courses Plus program, go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. Thanks for listening. My guest this week is none other than Matt Ridley, one of my longtime friends and colleagues, and I'm a great admirer of his all his other books. I've read them all. How Innovation Works is the new book, and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. So this is something of a sequel to Matt's previous 2 books, The Rational Optimist and The Evolution of Everything. This applied specifically to technologies and how they develop and why it's quite unpredictable. It's quite post-dictable. After it happens, you can trace the causal vectors that got us there and say, well, we should have seen that coming. But it never happens in terms of predictions. So Matt goes through that, the whole sequence of how that happens with lots of examples, super interesting examples: computers, search engines, airplanes, automobiles, vaccines. We talk a little bit about that because of the COVID-19 and so forth. So with that, I give you Matt Ridley. Well, let's see. We're speaking on, May 15th here, and maybe an entree into your book on innovation is the COVID-19 vaccine. Last night on the news.
One of the things you should know is that I've written an afterword, but only for the British edition.
Oh, okay.
Because the US edition was already printing by the time the lockdowns all came into effect.
Right. Well, like on the news last night, there was a story from the director of the CDC, now a whistleblower, claiming that we're nowhere near to having a vaccine. It's going to be 12 to 18 months and so on. Next story on the news, this is on NBC, is the Oxford team is close to having a vaccine maybe by September. It's like, I hope these people are watching this story here because something's going on here. I mean, maybe Oxford is a center of innovation compared to the CDC. Maybe it's too big or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a bit of that, but also, I don't think one can put huge faith in the Oxford thing yet because it's still experimental and so on, but it's in monkeys and it's working there apparently. So it does sound relatively promising. And one of the things I say in the are we recording yet, by the way?
Yeah, we're going.
Oh, good. We're off. Good. Okay, this is great. One of the things I say in my afterword is that it's clear that the failure to speed up vaccine development is a really good example of the kind of innovation we've failed to do over the past 10 or 20 years. In the book, I described the development of the whooping cough vaccine by 2 rather remarkable women in the US in the 1930s. And that took 4 years. Well, 4
Right.
years would be quite fast these days for the development of a
Right.
vaccine.
Right.
And actually, before the pandemic started, Wayne Koff, who's the president of the Global Vaccines Institute, was complaining about how it's still far too cumbersome and slow, the vaccine development process. And that's partly because the pharmaceutical industry is not interested, because on the whole, they can't make money out of vaccines, because if the vaccine works, it does itself out of business pretty fast before you've earned any money from it. And the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust have started something called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, which is mainly about speeding up vaccine development, but it's only just got going in the last few years. And the World Health Organization should have been doing this 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I was at that TED conference in Vancouver when Bill Gates gave that now viral speech. It's like we were all sitting there thinking, yeah, we've all heard this before.
Right.
We've escaped these kind of pandemics in the past without disaster. So, I can sort of see the heuristics kicking in there of postponing any kind of innovative action. But also seems like it would be restricted. It can't be exactly a Moore's law of progress on vaccines, because it takes a while for the human body to respond. You just have to wait a certain number of weeks to see if it works or not, right?
Yeah, but the other problem is you've got to wait for the person to become exposed to the vaccine, to the virus.
Right.
It's no good giving them a vaccine and saying, yeah, it works. They haven't caught the the virus when they haven't been exposed to the virus. So unless you're going to deliberately expose your experimental subjects to the virus, then it's going to be quite a long time before you've gathered enough data to see whether it works.
Yeah.
And that's really the time-consuming feature of vaccine development. Now, is there a way of speeding that up with clever, modern in vitro and in silico technology? Yeah, there must be some, but there's going to be a limit on how fast you can make it. Quite right.
Yeah. What is your sense going forward, just on this same theme of in years to come or decades to come? What do you think is going to change, or is it just impossible to say yet because there's still so much unknown?
Well, I think when these things happen, we think the world is going to change overnight, and it tends not to. After 9/11, we all went back to flying. It was a lot more inconvenient. There was a lot more security, but basically the world went on as before. We had wars and things, but not that much change. Not as much changed as we thought that morning, I would say.
Right.
Likewise, I think we will, when this lockdown is over, say, good, I want to go to dinner with my friends. I want to attend conferences. I want to fly away on holiday. So a lot of the world will go back to normal. But I am very struck by how many friends I'm talking to who say that they're secretly quite enjoying lockdown. Now, that might be because they're middle-class people with a big garden, so it's not that much of a thing. But they're also enjoying something else, which is the lack of FOMO, fear of missing out.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you're not allowed to fly around the world and attend a conference and go to a dinner party with a friend, then you don't feel guilty about not doing so. Right.
And no one else is either.
And no one else is either. And so no one's getting ahead of you in the networking game. People are describing their life almost as if they're in a Jane Austen novel. That you get up, you see the same person day in, day out. Mr. Knightley blows into town, Mr. Darcy blows into town once every 5 years, and that's about it. With the exception that every now and then you can go to a supermarket and buy food from all around the world. The other thing that's happened is the extraordinary way in which the private sector food supply is kept going in most countries really well. I think that's a nice example of that. But I do think, I certainly will be very keen. If somebody invites me to speak at a conference the other side of the world, I will now reply, no, sorry, it doesn't fit my travel plans, not going to put in 14 hours to get there, but boy, would I be happy to appear on a screen and give you a talk for that. I'm sure we've reached critical mass on that now.
Yeah.
I'd never used Zoom. Well, I think I'd used Zoom once before this. I'd never used Teams. I'd never used Zencaster. I'd used Skype, but I hadn't used many of these other programs. We're all now immediately familiar with them. Yeah. That has sort of broken the ice on this kind of world, surely.
I wonder too about higher education. A good portion of it is just the exchange of knowledge. I've been recording all my lectures remotely and posting them, and then sending the link to the students, and then they get a quiz, and they take the quiz, they send that back, they watch the lecture. We don't need brick and mortar buildings for that. Although obviously seminars would be, greatly missed. Sitting in a room with 20 students, we can't get that with Zoom in quite the same way.
I remember a conversation with the managing director of The Economist magazine in the 1980s, in which I think I said, or someone else said, I've got to write a 3-page article, so I'm going home so that to get away from the distractions to actually do the writing. And he said, why am I paying sky-high rents for a building in the middle of London when the first thing you will do when you've actually got some real work to do is you go home?
Right. Yeah, well, writers and researchers could certainly do a lot of stuff at home.
Yeah.
I suppose other people don't have that luxury.
Well, exactly. And I think it's been a very different experience for those of us who can work from home compared with those who don't. For those who have got small children, or those who haven't, those who've got a garden, or those who are in a small apartment, it's an extraordinary experience, and will have all sorts of unforeseen consequences. And the effect on mental health and other things is not to be underestimated. This is not going to be a good period for humanity.
You think the handshake is gone forever?
Well, I hope so. I actually said right back in February, I think it was in January actually, when this virus was first starting to be mentioned, I wrote an article saying, look, I had a perfectly ordinary cold a few weeks ago, and I refused to shake hands with people. I actually bumped into a Hollywood celeb once, and I was introduced to him, and he wouldn't shake my hand. He gave me his elbow. He said, I've got a cold. He may or may not have had a cold. He may have just not wanted to get my cold. But I thought, hang on, he's got a good point. Why on earth do we shake hands with strangers? We're just passing on viruses that way. Right. So I rather hope that habit has gone. It's a pretty weird habit when you think about it.
Yeah.
Why not just do that thing, or
the yoga bow,
a bow or something like that,
or a virtual, fist bump,
or
or
a
something like that.
virtual bump. Yeah, exactly. So I rather hope that we have cracked that cultural.
And that could cause a decrease in other diseases, contagious diseases.
Well, I think it'll be very interesting to see if a modicum of social distancing and that kind of thing remains, whether or not we might actually have got on top of a problem which I've been grumbling about for years, which is that we put up with these things called the common cold, which are pretty brutal when you think about it. You spend a week feeling rotten.
And those are coronaviruses.
And some of them are coronaviruses, some of them are rhinoviruses, some of them are adenoviruses. And, it's not too bad for me now because my kids are grown up, so I get about one cold every winter. But when you've got 5-year-olds, you get about 3 or 4 colds every winter, or at least that was, and 2 or 3 in the summer too. So my experience is that we've not, we've been far too. Every other virus, we've made this big song and dance about getting rid of it. Smallpox or HIV or whatever it might be. But the British actually had a thing called the Common Cold Research Unit in the 60s and 70s. And I think Thatcher closed it down and said, look, this hasn't produced anything remotely resembling a cure or a vaccine in 40 years. I'm going to damn well shut it. She's probably right. But, it's a pity. We should be doing more research on common colds because there's hundreds of them.
Yes, right.
And it was only a matter of time before one of them turned out to have a certain amount of mortality attached to it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do think, too, remember that study at the end of last year? I think it was a German study showing that the average body temperature has been decreasing over the past century, based on sort of an average from the late 19th century.
Oh,
it's gone down like 1 degree. And the explanation was that we're just getting fewer inflammatory diseases. So the overall body temperature is going down. Maybe we'll see more of that.
That's very, very interesting point. Exactly. One of the side effects, though, of conquering infectious disease, particularly larger parasites, has been the rise of autoimmune and allergic disorders. There's absolutely no doubt about this. The science is incredibly clear that what has caused, the increase in hay fever and asthma and all these kind of things is the fact that we don't have worms in our bodies. These are basically the anti-worm system, which is overreacting. And I used to say, well, why would it overreact? That seems a sort of strangely sort of anthropomorphic explanation. But in fact, there's actually a good reason. And I got this from a very good book called An Epidemic of Absence, which is about this phenomenon. And the good reason is the first thing a parasite does, a worm does when it gets into your body, is try and modulate your immune system. Is try and shut down your immune system so that you don't kick it out. Okay. So the immune system is expecting to be downregulated by the parasites it's attacking. So it's always going to be set too high. It's always going to be set on an overreaction to make up for the fact that it's going to be combated. And that sort of makes sense. So, we have to find a way of getting whatever it is out of a worm that downregulates the immune system, or at least gives it something to do, and injecting that into people so they don't get hay fever and asthma and all these kind of things. And if we get rid of all the common colds in the wake of this, we may find that there are other autoimmune problems that come in as a result. Right.
There's kind of an evolutionary psychology and biology going on inside our bodies, competition over time.
It's an arms race.
An arms race, yeah, exactly. A red queen effect.
A red queen, exactly that.
Back to that was your first book, I think, right?
It was, yeah. Effectively, I wrote a bad book before that nobody knows about, luckily.
Oh, I don't think I even know about that.
Good.
Well, the new book is How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. So the interesting structure of this book, you sort of give lots and lots of examples in the first half of the book, and the second half is kind of the theory behind innovation. So let's start there. I see it as sort of the biggest causal explanation, freedom in general, and then narrowing down to specific effects that cause innovation to go up or down. So let's just start with the general causal thesis here is freedom and innovation.
Yeah. The common theme of what works to encourage innovation to happen in a society seems to me to be the word freedom. Freedom to exchange ideas, freedom to experiment with different options and possibilities, freedom to fail, freedom to invest where you want. And this is a surprisingly rare thing. In most societies at most times, someone has stopped you having these kinds of freedom,
right.
And has actually made it very difficult, either by banning innovation or banning exchange or banning trade or banning movement or all these kind of freedoms that lead to it. So it's a surprisingly rare phenomenon. It's usually associated with city-states rather than empires. Empires are really bad at innovation. I mean, the Roman Empire didn't produce much innovation, considering the scale and the period it lived, compared with the city-states of Greece, which were much more inventive. Likewise, in China, the Song dynasty produced a lot of innovation, but it was a very decentralized dynasty without much central control, with a lot of freedom, whereas the Ming dynasty was an extremely centralized and extremely dirigiste regime, where merchants were only allowed to travel within 13 miles of their birthplace and that kind of thing. And as a result, it killed the goose that was laying the golden eggs. America is the kind of exception that proves the rule, because America looks like an empire from the outside, but actually when you get inside it, it's a bunch of city-states called California and Texas and so on. And I noticed just this week, Elon Musk was
threatening to leave California,
which is exactly what entrepreneurs and innovators did in Europe for many centuries. Was they took advantage of the fact that there were borders to say, I don't like the way this regime is treating me. I'm going to move to another regime to find one that's more congenial. And so these kinds of freedom are absolutely crucial to the development of innovation.
Yeah, and I was glad to see you deal with China toward the end there, because that seems to be, on the outside, one big exception. Here you have a communist dictatorship regime, and yet they're pretty innovative. So what's the explanation for that?
Yeah, my explanation for that, which may or may not be right, I don't claim it's a little bit of a special pleading argument, is that it's a very, very unfree regime at the political level. try starting a new political party. That innovation won't go down well in China. But it's a very, very free regime at the local level. And by that, I mean, if you want to start a business or invent a gadget or do some new development in the West, you run up against a lot of local bureaucracy, regulators and beadles of various kind who tell you what you can and can't do and take 6 months to give you a license to do it. Whereas in China, there's none of that. And you find this if you go there and you talk to people and they say, well, I had this idea, so I built a lab in a week and started on it, and here it is. Or I had this idea and I built a headquarters. So entrepreneurs are actually surprisingly free in China as long as they don't annoy the Communist Party.
Right. Yeah.
Which is a big if.
Now, that kind of makes sense to me because you have to look at the details on that to see what the effects are. Reading your book, I was just amazed at how much time and resources and energy governments have spent squelching innovation, and especially innovators suing each other. And most people that are pro freedom and liberty, libertarians, praise property rights and intellectual property rights and the patent system and so on. So I was surprised to see you kind of take a different perspective on that. Is not good for innovation.
Yeah. Well, I think the analogy is false. I don't think just because the word property is in both that there's any real equivalence between a genuine property right where you own your house and therefore have an incentive in making the house as nice as possible and owning a patent. Because the point of a patent is to share it. There's no point in making an innovation and then keeping it entirely to yourself. By definition, a patent is something that you publish and make available to everybody. But in exchange, you get a monopoly on the rewards from that innovation. Now, does that system work as an encouragement to innovation? The answer is no. You can look at historical evidence, you look at geographical evidence, you can look at all sorts of examples. And what you find is that strengthening the patent system does not seem to encourage innovation in any country or time in history. The same is true of copyright. You abolish copyright effectively in music with the invention of Napster and things like that. You don't abolish it, but it becomes futile to try and pursue intellectual property in music. Does that lead to a drop in the amount of innovation in music? No, quite the reverse. And if you look at specific cases, when a patent expires, you get a burst of innovation. This happened with the steam engine when Watt's patents expired. It happened with photography when the French government bought out Daguerre's patent. It happened with corrugated iron in the mid 19th century when the original patent expired, and there's an explosion of new uses for it and experiments in how to improve it and so on. And it's happened very recently with 3D printing. The expiry of the patent has led to a burst of innovation. And also a lot of great innovators, and I detail this in the book, people like Samuel Morse and the Wright brothers, spent an awful lot of their time in court frantically battling to defend their patents. Sometimes they had a point, but not always. Sometimes the other guy actually had invented some of the devices independently, and he should have been able to share in the profits. And why waste all this money on lawyers?
Well, the lawyers like it.
Well, and of course, therein lies why it still exists. But yeah, I mean, we've just strengthened copyright in the last 10 years so that my grandchildren can earn money from my books. Good luck to them; they won't make that much for 70 years after my death. Yeah. What's conceivable justification is that? Is that supposed to incentivize me to write books? It's not the reason I write books.
Right.
I mean,
but isn't it to protect the individual creator? So if I decide I'm going to write a Harry Potter novel and use the same character names, I'm going to get sued because you can't do that. And doesn't J.K. Rowling have a right to own her creation?
Well, Anthony Horowitz wrote a book. We read it to our kids and we thought, whoa, this guy's ripped off J.K. Rowling. It's full of flying owls and magicians. And we thought, how weird. So we met him at a literary festival, and we said, "What's this? You've ripped off J.K. Rowling." He said, "No, I wrote my book first."
Oh,
It's
really?
just that, yeah. And Kevin Kelly has a section on this in his book, What Technology Wants. He says, it turns out that owls as messengers is a meme that was out there, and lots of people were using it.
So there's another example of your gradual, incremental, multiple sources of innovation.
Inevitability of innovation.
Yeah. Well, last year we had a big trial here in California with Led Zeppelin's song "Stairway to Heaven," and they were being sued by the family of this musician who's now dead, who claimed that he invented that guitar riff at the beginning.
Right.
As if that's what makes the song great, and
Exactly.
And it isn't. When you listen to the original song that this guy said they ripped off, it's not very good.
Right, exactly. And I mean, in Rational Optimist, I quoted the lyrics of What a Wonderful World. And it turned out I had to write personally to 3 different copyright holders to that song and get permission. Even though that song's been in use for, and all I want to do is quote it, and I had to pay something like $200 or something. It was, this is not a clever way to run the world. But to be serious, people like Alex Tabarrok have actually made a very consistent argument that the evidence points to patents being more of a hindrance than a help in the innovation system generally. That doesn't mean you can't make the case for them in some cases like drug development. But even there, a prize might work better. If you say, look, there's a huge reward for whoever can produce a vaccine against pneumococcus vaccine. The reward will come in the form of a lucrative contract to top up the price that you get for selling this vaccine. This is a real example, by the way. This is what the Gates Foundation did. They offered a prize for the development of a pneumococcus vaccine. It's probably saved 750,000 lives.
Right. So there you have an immediate financial incentive to solve some particular problem. Yeah. Let's explore this idea of discovery versus invention, art versus science and technology. Even art, I think you would say, like we just talked about with music, there are just developmental themes that come along, and it's just sort of a natural time for everybody to take up that particular style, and then it goes for a while. And so in a way, it's like Dadaism or whatever would naturally develop in a culture in which certain threads are coming together in the same way that the light bulb was going to come around in that same decade, or any other scientific discovery, Wallace and Darwin around that same time.
That's right. It's obviously less true of art than it is of science, that you get simultaneous discovery. So I don't think you can say that if Leonardo had not painted the Mona Lisa, or Beethoven had not written the Ninth Symphony, that we would have had one of them.
Right. Right.
Whereas I think you can say that if Darwin hadn't discovered natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace would have done. If Einstein hadn't discovered special relativity, Hendrik Lorentz would have done. It might have taken a little bit longer. And if Thomas Edison hadn't built the light bulb, then someone else would have done. And more recently, of course, if Sergey Brin had never met Larry Page, would we have no search engines today? No, of course we would. We'd have lots. In fact, one of the things that fascinates me about these cases of simultaneous discovery and invention is that they look fantastically obvious in retrospect. It looks blindingly obvious that once the internet had been invented, people would invent search engines. Indeed, it's obvious that search engines would be the way to make money out of the internet. But if you go back to before the search engine invented, expecting to find everybody saying, once we invent the internet, it's going to be really obvious that we'll need search engines.
Right.
Nobody's saying that.
Right.
It's surprisingly asymmetrical in that sense.
Yeah. Making it impossible to predict.
Well, and I quote some of the ridiculous things clever people have said about the future, showing how difficult it is to predict. The head of the big mini computer firm, I've forgotten his name suddenly, in Massachusetts, saying nobody will want a computer in their own home.
Joy. Bill Joy?
No, it's
Marvin Minsky? No. No. Yeah.
No.
Anyway.
I can't look it up because my computer's frozen. But Digital Equipment Corporation is the name of the company.
Okay.
And he was a fairly well-known name at the time. But equally, Paul Allen said there's no chance that the iPhone will gain significant market share. No chance.
Right.
He said that just after the iPhone was launched. So don't rely on individuals to forecast the future. I'm fascinated by one phenomenon, which is the way in which the innovation bushfire switches from one area to another. So my grandparents lived through a period of incredible changes in transport. They were born before the motor car, and they died before the motor car or the aeroplane, and they died with men on the moon and supersonic planes in the sky. On the other hand, they lived through no changes in computers communications to speak of. They were born after the telephone, they died with the telephone. Not much change. I, on the other hand, have seen incredible changes in computers and communication and almost no changes in transport.
Yeah.
So 747s are still flying. They're 50 years old now. And if you look at the futurology of the 1950s, it's all about transport. It's all about personal gyrocopters and routine space travel and all that kind of thing. And I found the thing from the year I was born, actually, which is a picture of the future in the 2000s, and it shows a mailman delivering letters, old-fashioned handwritten letters, with a rocket on his back.
We were talking about the near impossibility of predicting the future of innovation and technology, and how badly we failed in the late 80s, early 90s to predict what was going to happen with the internet. Yet, yes, it seems in hindsight really obvious what should have happened. But remember, Steve Jobs always said, you don't ask the people what they want, you just tell them what they want. But of course, that's hindsight, because we only know about the successes. It seems to me there's something of a really strong hindsight bias here with all innovation like that. I call this the biography bias, where you go through the airport stalls of business books, and they go and look at all the companies that were successful and mine what the characteristics are of those companies, but they don't make predictions. And had you predicted 20 years before which companies would be successful because of those characteristics, you would fail. And so we only hear. In other words, the model seems to be, well, you go to an elite college, then you drop out, then you move back to your parents' house and you start a technology company in the garage, and you become a billionaire. Okay, in the 70s, how many hippies moved back to their parents' house and started a company, and they went bust? We just never hear. No one writes biographies of them.
Right. It's a bit like quite a lot of good scientific ideas came from mavericks who were widely disparaged in their time. Doesn't mean that every maverick who is widely disparaged is actually a genius.
Right.
One of the things I do in the book is tell the story of Gordon Moore, because I think it's a very nice corrective to the idea that the only people who can really make a difference to the world as innovators are unreasonable, maverick, difficult human beings, Steve Jobs types, as it were. Right. Gordon Moore's not like that. He's apparently the nicest man you ever met. He's not an immigrant. He lives 10 miles from where he was born. Yeah. He's never really left California. He's mild-mannered. He's polite. He's all the things that a really great innovator shouldn't be, according to the cliche, and yet he is a really great innovator. Yeah. So there's some there are rules are there to be broken.
Right. And so in terms of like this issue of income inequality, and it's so unfair that Bill Gates is worth so much money, we shouldn't reward our innovators with that much of a payoff. But what we don't see is all the wannabe Bill Gates and Steve Jobs who failed. We don't give them money when they fail. We don't return their investments, or all the venture capitalists. I know one who gives me rough back of the envelope calculation. We hear 100 pitches, we fund one. Of the 100 we fund, one makes it to an IPO where the guy becomes a gazillionaire. all the rest are just either failures or they just kind of grind along and nothing special happens. And we're really banking on that one big payoff, right?
Yeah.
So, but we never hear about all the failures or the ones that just kind of barely make it. And so in a way, society is saying we are incentivizing innovation by giving you this incentive of there's a huge payoff at the end. Therefore, you should try because most of you are going to fail.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And by the way, the ones who succeed are also going to fail. They're just going to fail several times until they succeed. I mean, I tell the story of Amazon in the book, which is you can tell the history of the Amazon company as a catalogue of disastrous failures, if you want, if you leave the last chapter out.
Yeah.
And Bezos is quite clear about that. He says, no, that's the whole point. We were swinging and missing a lot of the time, and every now and then we swung and hit. And if you're not doing enough experiments, you're not going to swing and hit. And I'm not very good at baseball, but I think I know what he means by that analogy. This point that you need to do a lot of trial and error, both as an entrepreneur but also as a tech investor, is actually, I think, absolutely central. And it would be, again and again, if you actually read what people say about how they got to be successful innovators, whether it's Thomas Edison or the guy who invented the post-it note, Art Fry, or they always say just try lots of things, and you often end up getting an answer from an unexpected direction, not from where you think you're going to get it from. So there's an element of serendipity involved, and therefore you need to be prepared to change course and do something slightly different from what you expected to do, etc. And this is all very different from the idea of planned, directed, goal-oriented innovation, which we often hear about, particularly with respect to the way the public sector funds innovation, trying to pick winners, trying to say this is the way we need to go, etc., etc. I think it's a much more Darwinian, much more bottom-up sort of process, the emergence of spontaneous order. And in the end, the guys who make a huge fortune out of innovations, as you say, not only do a lot of their colleagues lose huge fortunes along the way, or lose collectively a huge fortune along the way, but they only take home a tiny proportion of the benefit they've created for humanity. The Bill Gates is extremely rich, but the wealth that the rest of us have from software, from the existence of software, the benefits in our lives are far greater than anything that Bill Gates has earned.
Yeah, there was a story in the paper yesterday that Bezos may become the first trillionaire in history. And of course,
I saw that.
And this is, of course, seen as a bad thing because, Amazon, it's so terrible what they're doing, employing hundreds of thousands of people when so many people are out of work and delivering products to your door when you can't get them at the store. This is just awful, just terrible.
Right. I mean, here in the UK, we've seemed to have made a bit of a mess of the logistics of our testing programs for the virus, and it's all about logistics. Well, right there, ringing my doorbell is a logistics operation of great skill.
Yeah.
Delivering a package of something non-essential. Why wasn't the job handed to them?
Right, exactly. Well, Amazon wasn't even profitable until, I don't know, maybe 2012 or 13 or something like that. It was pretty late in the game. I was buying Amazon stock just hoping something big would happen because as an author, I saw what they were doing with books and I thought, well, this could be successful. But, it was like, well, the stock is kind of down. It's up, it's down, it's up, it's doing nothing. The company is not profitable. So had it not made that turn where it started in delivering all kinds of products, then it would have gone bust probably, and it would just be another failure story of an entrepreneur that tried to make it rather than what it's become.
Correct. And that's a really
same thing with Jobs. With that before pre-iPhone, Apple would have been just seen as this kind of brief flare and then bust.
Yeah, and I didn't like the look of Apple's business model because it was all about proprietary systems. And I thought the future lay in open systems, and I still think it does in some ways. And actually, if you look at open source software is now gradually defeating closed software in the world, I gather. It's taking market share from it, but Apple is in that sense an exception to that rule.
Yeah.
And so again, not everything works out the way you expect it to. There's another Apple phenomenon that I think is very interesting, which is that the idea of fake it till you make it. That Jobs was apt to do this. He would tend to announce a product before he knew how to make it, or before his colleagues knew how to make it, essentially setting a target and saying, we're going to achieve this form of miniaturization or whatever it might be, daring, as it were, his software engineers to fulfill his promise. Edison did the same thing, interestingly. He would announce things. And Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of Theranos, also tried the same trick, and it didn't come off. Now, why is that? Well, one of the reasons it could come off in Steve Jobs' world is because Moore's law has this incredible and extraordinary feature, which is the smaller you make a transistor, the more reliable it gets, not the less reliable.
Right.
And the cheaper and faster and all those things. Whereas that's not true of blood tests. The smaller the sample you take, the less reliable the test. So she was betting on technology delivering for her in a way that it never could.
Right. Well, but had she been successful at some level, then everybody who invested in her would be appraised as, as insightful, seeing this genius, the next Steve Jobs coming up. But once she fails, then it's like, oh, they should have known this was a fraud, and so on.
Yep. No, there's hindsight's a marvelous thing, isn't it? It's a 20/20 vision, hindsight.
Well, I saw that documentary on Theranos, and, the fact that she kind of looks like Jobs with the turtlenecks, and she's an attractive woman, so all these old guys are like, oh yeah, I got to invest in this. It's like I think there's some evolutionary psychology going on there too.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that case, her prosecution is coming up later this year.
Right.
Court case. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I have a chapter in the book called Frauds, Fakes, Failures, and Fads. I'm not sure in which order I listed those four nouns, but I write about Theranos. I write about the fake bomb detectors.
Yeah, I have one of those golf ball finders.
You do?
Yeah.
Does it work?
Yeah, it works. If you go to a golf course and you walk around enough and point this thing, you eventually find a golf ball. Yeah, I'll tell you the story. In the 90s, Dateline NBC was doing a show on this golf ball finder because it was being sold to high school principals, administrators, to detect marijuana in students' lockers. But because they needed a probable cause to open students' lockers, right? So they would just walk down the hallway with this thing swinging left and right and just open lockers. Eventually you get a hit. Right. So I actually use this as a demonstration of, the scientific method of testing, with a controlled, and it use these little opaque cups. You can't see which one the golf ball's in. Do you do better than 50-50? No. Okay. End of story. But then it morphed into, from the golf ball finder to the marijuana finder to then you could find anything. And he had this little chip that you would slip in there that allegedly had a piece of the material you wanted to find. So it's like sympathetic magic. It's like the stuff is sending out, and it would attracts like. It's just crazy. And then, like 10 years later, I see it's being sold for like $50,000 a piece for bomb detection. And that guy McCormick, I think he's in jail now.
In Iraq, it led to a lot of deaths. Yeah.
Yeah. So frauds, of course, but that's again in hindsight. Although I suppose I should have seen that one coming. The kind of trial and error Darwinian method. I was thinking of Dean Keith Simonton's theory about creativity, which is that it's a Darwinian process, and that when we look at the great creators like Mozart, we think of them as just born with this gift, and they just sort of plop down and start doing it. Whereas in the case of Mozart, he was composing music from the time he was like age 5 or something like that. His father was a musician, and, there was a lot of trial and error before you see the final product. And, And then there was somebody else that had a book on technology showing sort of all the trial and error of like barbed wire, stone tools, things like that, where you kind of see an evolutionary process. If you only take the end product, it looks like it was just created out of whole cloth in this one creative genius stroke of genius. And that's your point in your book, I think.
Yeah. No, I think, in my book, The Evolution of Everything, I very much make the case that there is it's essentially an evolutionary phenomenon, a lot of this, and it's very, very purely Darwinian. And it's not even an analogy, this, because as long as there's an element of fidelity in copying, and as long as there's an element of variation, then the Darwinian process will kick in. It doesn't need to be a perfectly faithful copying device like a genome is, and it doesn't need to have random mutation. The mutation can be non-random, but as long as it's got there's error as well, then then it'll work.
Yeah, I love you had a chapter on the origins of life as a form of innovation.
Well, this was a little cheeky of me in a book about innovation to suddenly throw in unconscious biological innovation, such as the origin of life. I start that chapter by talking about agriculture, which is clearly an innovation 10,000 years ago. And I then say, well, what about the dog? Is the dog an innovation? Well, between ourselves and the dog 25,000 years ago, we came up with an arrangement that benefited both sides. And yes, the dog is a tool for human beings, and it was invented. Might have been invented by the dog rather than us.
Right.
Right. The dog domesticated us rather than the other way around. And then, I go back to the original sort of stone tools of 500,000 years ago and so on. And eventually I end up talking about the origin of life as an invention, as an innovation, because essentially the same sort of processes are happening. It's just that it's unconscious. But then I'm not sure quite how conscious our innovation is either. Right. It's basically a form of trial and error. I often make the point that you look at an airplane and you say, well, of course it's designed. There's a designer. There's a guy in Boeing headquarters who draws it on a computer-aided device. But then, well, he didn't start from scratch, did he? Most of the ideas he put in, he got from previous airplane designs. Right. And most of those airplane designs came from previous airplane designs, and so on, right back to the Wright Brothers. And the good ideas were kept and the bad ideas were dropped. And so it's exactly like evolution.
Yeah, I love that section of the chapter on the Wright Brothers where, we want to put a moment on it. It was December 3rd at 4:34 p.m. that we achieved human flight. Well, it was just sort of a hop. What was it, 13 seconds or something like that? And then the next one was 30 seconds. The next one was 2 minutes. It just sort of goes along. And even the warp of the wing, they just kept experimenting. Of course, I love that because they're cyclists, and cyclists are always trying to tweak their bikes because the bicycle is an amazing innovation
That's
itself.
Interesting.
Incredibly innovative. Just the structure of putting a human body to propel forward. But you can tweak it, and cyclists are still tweaking it. I mean, I just got a new bike last year. And 5 years ago, I got this Canyon carbon fiber bike, top of the line, German bike, German engineering, just as good as it could be. And the first time I rode this, I thought, well, this is it. There's no way they could improve on this. 5 years later, this thing's sitting in my garage. It's like, oh, this piece of crap. I got a new bike, and it's 2% better.
Okay, really interesting. But do you do the innovation? In other words, is there user-driven innovation in this? Do you feed ideas back to the bicycle maker?
Well, the professional cyclists do. For example, they work with the top designers at the bike companies. They're hired to do so in a sense, and they're always like messing around with like how deep should the rims be on a carbon fiber wheel? Let me see if I have one here. So here's a carbon fiber wheel. It's not very deep, but some of them are like this deep. And if you go really deep, then the wind on the side catches it, and that actually slows you down. So you have to make it just kind of the right. So that's a pretty good level there. It's deep enough it absorbs vibration, but not so deep that the crosswinds hit it. Right. So even wheel sets like this, you could spend a couple $1,000s just on the wheels. And, they've kind of fine-tuned those things just to the point where it's like, 0.5% difference. But if you're a
Really?
pro cyclist and, it's a 40K time trial and you can save 5 seconds, something like that, that's the difference
makes a
between
difference.
winning or not. Now, how does that affect the regular cyclist? Because those super expensive wheel sets then come down in price as they manufacture more and more of them. And more, everyday cyclists want to ride the really good equipment because it feels better and you can tell the difference. So then the price comes down and now you can buy what used to be like a $15,000 Tour de France bike for $5,000. Now, to a lot of people, that sounds like a lot of money, but really it's cheap compared to, if you only have to you buy a bike once every 5 years or so. And compared to golf or some other expensive sports, it's not that bad.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So innovation and then sort of the marketing of products, sort of capitalism, free market.
Actually, that's a really nice example of what I mean by innovation as opposed to invention. No, you're not there saying that there's an inventor who came up with this. It's not an invention. It's an incremental change to make it more effective or affordable or something like that. Just bit by bit, tinkering here and there. It's very much the process by which everything gets done.
Yeah.
So I think we got a bit sidetracked by the idea of disruptive innovation, where bang, something comes in and changes the world. Actually, much more of the time, it's the kind of thing you're describing, where little changes are made here and there by everybody, and fed back into the system, and then combined with other little changes.
Yeah. Even bicycle helmets. When I first started riding, cyclists were wearing these idiotic leather hairnets. It was just leather with cotton stuffed in it, as if that was going to protect your head if you hit the pavement. And Bell helmets already had a expanded polystyrene helmet for their motorcycles. And then they made one for bicycles, but it was super geeky looking. It was this big, huge thing, it was white, and, no one wanted to be seen wearing this thing because no one wore helmets. So when they were my sponsor for Race Across America, they said, we want to appeal to pro racers and therefore serious cyclists, and no one will buy our helmet. I said, well, you got to make it look like one of these leather hairnets, black and sleek and tight with a lot of air holes so that the air goes in there. So they did. They designed this V1 Pro, and I was in there with them. And, I said, you got to drill more slots so more air gets in there, and you got to make it tighter to the head, because if it's this big thing, it looks like a total geek. Cyclists call them Freds. And so that's what we came up with. And, so all the components were there already. They just sort of reconfigured them. And same thing with gloves. The first year I did it was called the Great American Bike Race at the time, 1982, and it was filmed and aired on ABC Wide World of Sports in '83. And we all had saddle sores and carpal tunnel syndrome from just holding the handlebars for days on end. And this guy, Wayman Spence in Waco, Texas, watched this. And he said, hang on, I have a product that would pad saddles and hands. It's this stuff he uses for bed sores patients. It's this like the super soft, spongy, gooey stuff that you put between two sheets, like plastic sheets or whatever, so it's nice and squishy. And you put it on a bed so long-term patients don't get bed sores. And he thought, I could just take this stuff and sew it into gloves and sew it into a saddle pad and put that on a saddle. So he flew me down to Waco, and I sat there with the seamstresses fooling around with gloves and saddle pads, and that became Spenco products. And he was super successful with that. And now pretty much everybody has padded gloves and saddle pads now.
This is fantastic. Michael, this is absolutely brilliant. I just wish I'd put a chapter in on cycle innovation, because it's a beautiful illustration of the kind of things
it
that
is,
I'm
because,
interested in.
again, it's incremental. It's like I just have this one little thing that's bothering me, and just need one tiny little bit of help, and it'll make it so much better, and even if it's just incremental, it does make a difference cumulatively over time. So bicycles now are really truly better than they were 50 years ago or whatever, even though the overall design is pretty efficient. If you just go back, say, a century, that design is pretty efficient. So anyway, let's continue with some of your.
But you're also illustrating that Brian Arthur's point that every technology is a combination of other technologies.
Right. Yeah.
What you need to do is bring together ideas from other directions.
That seems just totally random or serendipitous. Well, you talk about serendipity as a big force, again, unpredictable. So innovation.
Well, my favorite example of what I call ideas having sex, is when the pill camera was invented after a conversation between a gastroenterologist over a garden fence with a guided missile designer.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Now, if you're a bureaucrat or a CEO of a company, you're not going to be able to structure it to make that happen.
Exactly. We talked about empires, but big companies have the same problem, that it just doesn't happen in them. Unless, like Procter and Gamble, they say this isn't working, and they step outside and say, we're going to get all our ideas from outside the company. We're going to run an open innovation network. Or Amazon actually has a system of sort of ensuring that maverick ideas reach the top levels of management. Even if everyone thinks it's a bad idea, as long as one person is standing up for it, then it has to be reported upwards. So there are ways of running big companies so they don't lose their innovation mojo, but most of them do eventually.
Yeah, like when Google instituted that 20% work time spent on projects that one day a week, do whatever you want. Yeah, it's sort of structured, unstructured time. Yeah.
Does it produce the goods?
I don't know. The X projects that they have and all that stuff. What's come out of that? I don't know.
Well, I discuss X in the book, and there are some quite nice things. There's also some really dumb ideas that they pursued for a long time, which didn't go anywhere. And Google Glass is their most famous failure, I guess. They would say, we don't mind failing. We need to keep failing. One day we'll succeed.
Yeah, the Google Glass, that's an interesting example, because had that been successful, then it would have been one of those, we should have seen this coming. The internet is right there in front of you. Why did it not succeed? That does seem like a good idea.
It's a combination of sort of adding insufficient extra utility and not being cool.
Oh, right. It was kind of geeky looking.
Yeah.
Sergey Brin was walking around TED with this thing, and it's like, okay. And then Robin Williams made a joke about, glass holes. That's who that
was probably the
they probably did it in, yeah. Innovation is gradual. We talked about that. Innovation is different from invention. Yeah, we mentioned that. Yeah, anybody can invent a bunch of things. Well, not anybody, but clever people could invent all sorts of things half a dozen before breakfast, I suppose. It's the bringing it to fruition that's the hard part.
Yeah, and yet the inventors don't realize that, and they get very cross when they end up with so little of the rewards, and the guy who turns it into something actually practical ends up with so much of the rewards. I mean, I tell the story in the book of the Haber-Bosch process, the fixing of nitrogen, and Haber's the scientist who has the original sort of breakthrough, and tends to this day to get the most credit. But Bosch is the guy who really does it, because he does these unbelievably expensive and difficult experiments on a gigantic scale. His biggest scientific project before the Manhattan Project, probably, in which everything explodes every now and then and kills people and things like that, before finding the right catalyst, the right temperature, the right pressure at which you can fix nitrogen from the air. And it requires going out to other industries and sourcing the right kinds of steel and solving the problem that the hydrogen causes the metal to corrode, and all sorts of these practical problems, which are far more important than the original insight that with a catalyst you can make nitrogen react with methane.
Yeah. Right. To the inventor, you might say, well, you go ahead and start a company and raise the money and hire employees and maintain payroll and all the stuff that it takes to do that. That's not easy.
Right.
That's the hard part, really, I think. Here I was reading that part. I was thinking of Jimmy Wales versus the Google guys, or Steve Jobs or whoever. He invents Wikipedia, which has turned out to be this amazing thing, but he's not a billionaire.
Right.
Because it was started as a nonprofit rather than a for-profit.
Yeah. Well, and actually, some of the most interesting innovations I write about, like the impregnated mosquito net, which has saved more lives from malaria than any other technology, is a very, very simple innovation. Nobody has made money out of it. and yet it's saved a lot of lives. So it doesn't. A lot of these things are not necessarily motivated by profit.
Right.
There are other ways of motivating them, but a lot of things motivated by profit have done a lot of good too.
Yeah. Yeah. Another couple of TED conference examples. There is the mosquito laser. I don't know if you ever saw this. So it was a laser device that could track a mosquito and zap it. And I forget the name of the guy that he's one of these great inventors that speaks at all the TEDs and so on. And anyway, I remember we were all sitting there going, yeah, what are you going to do? Set up lasers in Africa? And they're just zap, 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 zap. Oh yeah, we're going to have, lasers all around the village and zap, zap. It's like, okay, I don't know. The mosquito net seems much simpler and more effective. But I think it was 2006, the first time I went to TED when it was in Monterey, the guy that invented the touchscreen, gave a demonstration of this, and it was huge. It was like the size of a coffee table, and he was moving photographs around on this glass plate and expanding them, whoop, like this and so on. And it's like, whoa. And, it was shortly after that, somebody snapped that up. I don't know if this was the guy who invented it or improved it, or I don't really know the history of touch the screen glass. I don't even exactly know how it works, but obviously what iPhone is 2007. But when was when was that already a touchscreen in 2007, 2008, I think is around when that came about. Something
is
like
that
that.
right? I couldn't tell you. But a young person today will look at a view of a mountain in the distance and go,
yeah. Right. Yeah, like this with your book, what? I can't get it to you. Exactly. Right. Okay, innovation is a team sport. Right. Almost all these things are cumulatively through a lot of different people working. What do you mean by teams versus a solo genius working in isolation?
Well, the solo genius is nearly always a myth because he's either deliberately or accidentally not telling you about the people whose shoulders he's standing on,
right,
or indeed the people who stand on his shoulders to make it develop. I tell the story about Norman Borlaug, who is a great hero. Don't get me wrong. Who did a fantastic job of introducing high-yielding wheat varieties into India and Pakistan, and worked incredibly hard on it, having developed them in Mexico, and deserved the Nobel Peace Prize, in my view. But he didn't invent short-strawed wheat. He got the idea at a conference from a guy called Burton Bales, who I can't find very much about. He's an obscure agronomist. He'd got the idea from Orville Vogel in Oregon, who was crossing these short-strawed wheats. He'd got the idea from Cecil Salmon, who was on Douglas MacArthur's staff in Japan at the end of the war, and he went to some agricultural stations and found these wheats being grown there. They had been planted by a guy called Gonjiro Inazuka, who got the idea from, well, at that stage, the trail goes cold. We don't know. But, it's a nice example of how you can single out a great inventor, but he very rarely invents something out of nothing.
Right. Innovation is inexorable. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is back to that point about the simultaneous invention that the light bulb comes along, whether you like it or not. You can run over Edison with a tram, and you still get light bulbs. There's an inexorability, and of course, Moore's law shows you this progression. The thing I find puzzling about Moore's law is that once Gordon Moore spots that computers are improving at a certain rate, the rate doesn't change. That's
right.
weird. I mean, it changes a bit, but it doesn't change dramatically.
12 to 18
we don't say,
months.
right, well, we're going to get to 560 megabits or whatever it is in 30 years' time. Why don't we do it now?
Right. Yeah, but that doesn't apply to software, right? Just hardware. Moore's law.
Yes, no, that's true. The miniaturization phenomenon of Moore's law applies to hardware, but there are quite a lot of incremental progressions in technology that have a similarity to Moore's law, not necessarily in terms of. So another example, which I discuss in the book, is airline safety. The decline in fatalities per revenue passenger kilometer is spectacular. It's from thousands of deaths per million revenue passenger kilometers to 59 last year. It's an enormously steep increase, and it's pretty steady. What drives that? Better processes, better manuals, better ideas about checklists and so on.
Yeah.
Low tech, boring stuff,
Yeah.
but just inch by inch improving it. It's an extraordinary story, that. I mean, when you think how many flights take off and land every year, and yet in I think it was 2018 or was it 2017, one of those years, we actually for the first time got a year in which no commercial passenger jet crashed at all.
Right.
It's incredible, actually. And so that's a very nice example of an inexorable progressive improvement in a technology.
You know Stein's law, things that can't go on forever won't.
Yes. Beautiful.
Then somebody modified it and said, yes, but they can go on much longer than you think.
Exactly. And another version of that, which I dug out, I can't remember who came up with it, is it's certain that every 2 years someone will predict the end of Moore's law.
Right. That's right. Yeah. The number of people predicting the end of Moore's law is doubling every 12 to 18 months.
That's right. That's better.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to nuclear power because, as you write about, it hasn't been allowed to go through the trial and error phase, and therefore we're still stuck with these 1970s designs. Yeah.
That's the single problem about nuclear power. We can't innovate because we can't do trial and error. We can't do trial and error because we don't want errors in nuclear power stations, pretty obviously. But the process of licensing a nuclear power plant involves specifying in advance the exact design and not deviating from it. Now, that might sound like a sensible idea, but when you're talking about a hundreds of millions of dollars process of licensing and many years involved, it kills innovation. It means that you daren't try something new.
Right.
And normally, in constructing something as big as a nuclear power plant, you would halfway through the process say, well, somebody over there has invented a better material. Let's try that instead of this. And you would so nuclear power has cut itself off from the process by which technology learns.
Yeah.
That's my view.
Well, cut itself off. Governments have basically, through regulation, said you cannot do this because we have a zero tolerance for failure.
Exactly. And one of the interesting things will be whether or not when fusion comes along, we are able to design rules that don't repeat that mistake, but do keep it safe.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something extra about nuclear power as well. It's invisible. You can't smell it, taste it, touch it. It's just this invisible force that feels, kind of psychologically worse than, say, coal deaths or fossil fuel related deaths.
Yeah. I remember having an argument with a colleague on The Economist during the Chernobyl episode in the 1980s. He said, look, come on, if nuclear radiation was purple,
right,
we'd have banned it long ago.
Right.
And I said, no, quite the reverse. If it was purple, we'd see how little of it there was.
Right. Yeah, so we could target it and go, okay, we're gonna build a safety trap around that. Yeah, but we're used to. I forget what the stat is from your book. 3,000 people a year die in coal-related deaths or something like that, just from lung disease and falling off big equipment or whatever. But we're used to that. There's a Kahneman kind of heuristic going on where we're used to the one, so we accept it. But if 3,000 people died a year of nuclear or terrorism, we go crazy.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, Chernobyl teaches you that if you build the stupidest design with the most lethal inherent flaw in it and put the stupidest regime in charge of it, you still only kill a few hundred people at the most.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It wasn't nearly the disaster everybody was predicting at the time. And same thing with Fukushima, right? It wasn't the problem with the nuclear reactor itself. It was the water got in what was in the base? There was something that was below sea level.
The pumps to pump out the water were in a
yeah.
basement below sea level, which is not clever when you think about when a tidal wave's heading your way. And I make the argument with Fukushima that it was a relatively old design of nuclear reactor that should have been retired some years before. The reason it wasn't retired is because Japan wasn't building new reactors, so they tried to extend the lifespan. So they kept this less safe design, this flawed design, going longer than they should have done. If innovation had been allowed to happen in the nuclear industry, then Fukushima would have been closed and you'd have had a much safer design on the same site.
Let's talk about the economics of innovation, since we're in the middle of this whole idea of AI putting people out of work, and therefore, we should talk about a universal basic income, like Andrew Yang has been promoting. But historically, that's not really happened.
No, since the Luddites in the early 19th century, we've had predictions that technology will create mass unemployment, and it's always been wrong. I mean, utterly wrong. I mean, in the 1960s, under President Johnson, there was a big commission to study how we're going to deal with the inevitable unemployment that will result from automation. And, instead of which we've had the nearest we've ever come to full employment in recent years. How is that possible when automation clearly does do the work of lots of people? Well, because by being efficient, it creates the wealth that allows us to employ other people. And we, of course, automation also creates new jobs. So if you try to explain to a Victorian engineer what the role of a software designer was, you'd struggle, or a flight attendant.
Right.
These jobs didn't exist. But the interesting thing is that technology has given us more leisure. If you compare the length of the work week, or more importantly, the percentage of your life that you spend at work with today versus 150 years ago, it's a dramatic reduction. We're getting more leisure in terms of the weekend. We're getting more leisure in terms of a longer childhood and education. We're getting more leisure in terms of retirement. And it's quite an interesting thought experiment. I often ask people this question. If you live to 80 years old and you spend half your life at work, the other half in education or retirement, and you work full time, you're never unemployed, but you work a normal 40-hour week with normal holidays, normal time off, weekends and so on, what percentage of your total hours on the planet will you have spent at work? And it's quite an easy calculation, really, and it's around 10%.
Right.
It's incredibly low when you think about it.
Yeah, I was amazed.
Because it's a third of a day, and it's 5/7 of a week, and it's half of a lifetime, and then you take a little bit off for other things, and you come down to about 10%.
Yeah. Well, I guess the counter to that then is, back to the AI thing, is are you really thinking that truck drivers are going to become software engineers programming their self-driving trucks?
Yes, I do, because one of the features of the last 100 years is endless predictions that people can't be retrained for other tasks, and I think they can. In fact, the current excitement over AI causing unemployment is surprisingly middle class. In other words, it's about, well, okay, they came for the assembly line workers or the farm hands, but now they're coming for the lawyers and the doctors. Now we're really worried.
Right. And those people write books and go on TV shows to talk about this.
Exactly. I mean, I made a speech in the House of Lords, and I said, I said, no wonder you're all worried, because legislators could do this job. I mean, right. AI programs could do the legislation job.
Right. That's really funny. Yeah, that's like asking what are all those elevator operators going to do when the elevator AI comes along? Well, they found other things to do.
Right. Or wick trimmers.
Yeah, right. That's right. Wick trimmers. Right. The horse and buggy companies that went out of business. Right. Oh, dear. Yeah, that's just normal. So the economics of innovation, super interesting. I wanted to also talk about the restrictions on innovation, resistance to innovation. I love the coffee story. Incredible. You never would have thought a bureaucrat would be against, a politician or a autocrat would be against coffee houses.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
And there's this wonderful quote. There were two reasons why they were against coffee houses. One was because they were being lobbied by the wine and beer industry, probably, in those cases.
Yeah.
And two, because they figured out that people went to coffee houses and sat around talking. And you don't want people sitting around talking, because sooner or later they'll get around to talking about how the regime isn't any good.
Right.
And the regime doesn't like that.
And no good could come of that.
So explicit.
Yeah.
I mean, King Charles II in the 1670s in London, when he's trying to ban coffee houses, he makes this very clear. He says that it's a bad idea because people might go to coffee houses and tell lies. It's fake news that he's worried about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really funny. Let's see, the demonized and delayed case of biotechnology. I forget what that was about. Oh, the case of weed killer. Mobile telephony. Yes, another one. The story about the earliest ideas of mobile telephony go back many decades.
Mobile telephony actually is on the whole in the book, I make the case that technologies are not delayed by accident. In other words, they usually turn up when they're ready. A possible example is the wheeled suitcase of something that came too late, but I argue in the book that no, actually, it's not that much later than you'd expect, given the size of airports and the availability of porters and things like that. But mobile telephony might be an exception to that, because in the 1940s, people start talking about, hang on, instead of just calling radio to radio, you call to the nearest mast and then use the landline to the cell where the person has his radio. You could actually have a huge bandwidth. You could have an awful lot of people sharing mobile telephony. That's a good idea. Let's allocate some space on the spectrum for this idea. Can't have that because the television owns it already. And the television doesn't want to give it up. It's not actually using most of it, but it doesn't want to give it up. Oh, and by the way, the companies that make the radios that they sell to, oil rigs and things, they don't want this idea too, because they've got very lucrative markets supplying these ones that do high-powered direct radio. So actually 30, 40 years go by and nobody's really allowed to develop cellular telephony, even though the idea's been around. Now, it's possible you needed electronic miniaturization, et cetera, to help you make it actually practical before, to get the improvement in batteries and things like that. It wouldn't have taken off if you'd tried to do it in the 1970s instead of the 1990s. But it's certainly true that government allocating the spectrum and refusing to allocate spectrum for cellular telephony is an issue.
Now, is that under pressure from the television networks to restrict it? Yeah. So there you have an example of, crony capitalism.
Absolutely. And there's an awful lot of examples, and a lot of resistance to innovation turns out to be on behalf of incumbent technologies who don't want competition.
Right. Yeah. But publicly, their CEOs will say, I'm pro-free markets. I'm a capitalist. I love Ayn Rand. But behind closed doors, they're like, but don't let this guy compete against me. I wrote an op-ed piece for the LA Times on Elon Musk's when Tesla first started selling directly to consumers, and he was just going to skip the dealership thing. And the Automobile Dealership Association of America basically lobbied to stop this. And it's like, what do they care? Well, if this guy is selling directly to the public, what's our job? Because other automobile companies, they could do this too.
Right. Exactly.
Yet these are all these guys are conservative capitalists. Yeah. We believe in pro-free market, but don't let that Elon Musk guy. He's doing something wrong here. It's just so good. Oh, I also love the stuff about I forget who it is that we've reached peak stuff that we're just doing more with less. And
yes, isn't that interesting? Andrew McAfee's written a really good book on that called More for Less. And it looks like the US and a number of other countries, including the UK, are now using less stuff, less metal, less water, less land, even though their populations are still growing.
Yeah.
So we're getting more out of each incremental bit of technology. So we're not only using relatively less, we're starting to use absolutely less stuff. Yeah. That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And very unexpected.
Yeah. Yeah. My favorite example of that is, the stacks and stacks of albums and CDs gone. You don't need any of that.
Yeah. Exactly.
Although I do have a friend that swears that that vinyl records are still a better sound. But I think he likes the kind of the staticky background that you don't get with digital That's
Now,
subjective.
you'll always get nostalgics, who'd rather go on a steam train and all that, and they, they have a point. There's value in that kind of stuff, but for the rest of us, I mean, a very nice example of using, because the problem with the using less stuff argument has always been that, well, okay, but if you use less and make it cheaper, then people are just going to use more of it. They're just going to waste more of it. And so if LED lights are so much more efficient in terms of electricity use than incandescent bulbs, maybe they're using 10% or 20% of the electricity for a given amount of light, that sure, we'll leave more lights on, but we won't leave 5 times as many lights on, which is what it would take for us to actually be. This is called the Jevons paradox, when you end up using more energy because the devices have got more efficient. But you'd have to leave 5 times as many lights on in your house to use more electricity with LEDs than you do with incandescents.
Yeah.
And by the way, the short reign of the other technology between the incandescent and the LED, the compact fluorescent bulb, is a disastrous idea. It was imposed on us. It had to be forced on us because we didn't want to buy these damn things because they're slow to warm up, expensive, difficult to dispose of. The consumer didn't want them, but governments lobbied by Philips, who'd invented them, and other companies said, no, we're going to force you to do these to save energy. If they'd not done that, we'd have gone to LEDs quicker and we'd have saved even more.
Is it your book I was reading about? You were citing Jeffrey West's research on the size of cities and how efficient they are.
I do mention that.
Yeah. The bigger the city, the more
beautiful.
Right. So you have fewer per capita gas stations, restaurants, and so forth, just because there's more efficiency.
That's right. Per person, there are fewer gas stations, but per person, there are more restaurants.
More restaurants.
Sorry, the bigger the city, the fewer the gas stations per head, the fewer the miles of road or whatever.
Right.
So cities get denser and more efficient in terms of those resources, but in terms of knowledge resources like universities or coffee shops or something, they produce more. They're super abundant in the things that are related to sort of knowledge transfer, but they're underabundant in the sort of basic infrastructure. It's a very nice example of how a city is a sort of efficient organism.
In a way, your entire book and that idea of cities, it has to do with the second law of thermodynamics, just energy capture, the efficiency of that.
Yeah, no, I start the book talking about thermodynamics and I end it that way, and I think it's really important, and I'm very influenced by a very bright friend of mine called John Constable, who thinks about the world in this way, who says that basically what we are in the habit of as human beings is moving structures away from thermodynamic equilibrium, making them less probable, more improbable, more structured. So in the book, I say that the number of transistors on the planet, which are made of silicon, is now approaching the same order of magnitude as the number of sand grains on the planet, which are also made of silicon dioxide.
Right.
And that's really a kind of weird thought until you realize how small a transistor is.
Yeah.
But a transistor is structured, is non-random in its structure, is improbable in its structure, is anti-entropy, as it were, whereas a sand grain is high entropy.
Oh, right.
So we are, both we and life itself is in the business of using energy to reduce entropy on a local scale.
One of my favorite paper titles by Tooby and Cosmides is "The Second Law of Thermodynamics is the First Law of Psychology."
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. In other words, what's the goal of life? It's to capture energy, to carve out a little niche of order in a sea of entropy.
Completely. I've been saying that, but I hadn't realized I'd been ripping off Leader and John.
Well, and then in my previous book, Heavens on Earth, I changed it slightly to the second law of thermodynamics is the first law of life, because all of life is energy capture and carving out a little niche of order. And if you think about it, this is Pinker's analogy of the sandcastle. There's nothing mysterious about it. It's not like entropy is a force. It's just that there's far more ways for atoms to be and molecules to be configured into kind of a gooey mass rather than, say, a sandcastle. So a sandcastle takes a lot of very specific energy and order, which can easily, but there's only one way to create that particular sandcastle. There's 10,000 ways for it to be washed away into just a mass of sand. And pretty much that's all of life.
Yeah. And this is the reason, of course, why energy is such an absolutely central part of the innovation story. And affordable energy is an absolute necessity for keeping innovation going.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, really, in a way, it's what we're talking about with innovation. It really goes all the way back to the entire universe. Everything is just moving away from entropy. A star is basically a little niche of order that eventually will run out. And as you said, just the origins of life. The moment you put energy into a system, you're going to get maybe 100,000 experiments that fail to create a living organism, but only one has to succeed to get the ball rolling. Right.
One low entropy result and 100,000 high entropy results.
Right. But because there's, I don't know, 1 trillion planets in our galaxy alone, and there's 100 billion to 1 trillion galaxies, the chances that, that's only happened once, very low.
Right.
So in a way, I think of your argument
to the Fermi paradox.
Yeah,
if that's the case, where are they?
Yeah. What is your answer to that question?
To the Fermi paradox?
Yeah.
I don't really know. I'm not attracted by the sort of doom-mongering argument that the answer is because every civilization that gets to the stage where it might just start transmitting its ideas around the universe blows itself up before it does so.
Right. Right.
Which is one potential answer. That many planets have got to this stage, but none of them have survived the nuclear war that follows.
Yeah, right. That seems unlikely to me.
That just feels too like a standard doom-saying argument to me.
My answer is that they're probably out there somewhere. It's just that it's so vast and the distances between the stars are so incredible that the chances of anybody running into each other are pretty low.
Talking of which, do you know what's happened to Betelgeuse? Has it got bright again? Did you follow that story?
Supposedly, it could. They're talking about it could go supernova, and that we'd be able to see it during the day. But then I think Neil deGrasse Tyson tweeted something like it could happen tomorrow, or it could happen 1,000,000 years from now. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, right, exactly. But it's gone really faint.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's still like that.
Yeah, my favorite number on this is the Voyager spacecraft is hauling along at like 70,000 miles an hour or some such thing. No, I think it's more like 40,000 miles an hour. And if it was heading to the nearest star, which it's not, it would take 70,000 years to get there. So,
wow.
So the distances are just
that's
so
inside
vast.
our galaxy.
Yeah. That's just the local part of the galaxy. So the chances.
Yeah.
Anyway, Matt, we've been going on for an hour and a half here. I see this book is How Innovation Works. It's something of a third volume of your trilogy. If you start with The Rational Optimist, The Evolution of Everything, it seems to kind of climax with that.
I actually do think of it that way. You're absolutely right. Yeah. I have taken a different tack as a writer in this book in telling these stories. It's got a lot more sort of narrative in it than most
storytelling.
Of mine. Because I wanted the lesson to emerge from the narrative.
Although I love James Burke, his Connection series. I've watched all those over and over and over. I couldn't get enough of that stuff. So interesting, and he's such a clever guy. But he didn't overlay any theory behind it, which I like because you're a scientist, so you do that because that's what scientists do. Why is it happened this way, instead of this way? And so you probably grew up watching James Burke stuff in the 60s and 70s.
I did watch some of it, although I didn't watch as much as I would have liked. And I don't know whether I sort of missed it on British TV or something. But anyway, I don't have the same familiarity with it that some people in the US do.
Yeah. So what's next? What's volume 4 of your trilogy?
Don't know is the short answer.
Okay.
But maybe retirement. How about that?
What? Well, you remember Parliament, right? So you could do that in perpetuity.
Yeah, for now. We're trying to figure out how to make Parliament work virtually. It's not very easy at the moment. But that will continue. But I have to say, I've found the enforced lockdown to be not entirely uncongenial. Sitting at home writing and reading and every now and then having a conversation like this is quite a nice way to live.
I agree.
Hell, queuing for security at airports.
Yes, I know. I back to where we started, I kind of feel the same way. I'm in Santa Barbara, which is not so bad. And my wife's first law is never leave Santa Barbara, because whenever I go down to L.A., I'm always calling her, grumbling and groaning about the traffic and the smog and this and that. She goes, "I told you, don't leave Santa Barbara. What are you doing down there?"
Yeah, no, she's not wrong. I've been to Santa Barbara. It's a magical place. And I'm the same. Every time I go to London, I think, why do I do this?
Right. Could something like Congress or Parliament just be done through Zoom if it was maybe slightly more efficient? Or
it's not working at all well. The cut and thrust of debate is very difficult on Zoom. You can't speak over each other. You can't interrupt each other. You can't score points off each other in the same way. They've done. They did actually. We haven't voted in the House of Lords since lockdown started, but the House of Commons has voted last week, and couple of people, including the second most senior minister in the government, Rishi Sunak, voted the wrong way by mistake because the system was a bit confusing. I'm afraid it's proving, and this is a point I talk about in the book, that the one thing you can't seem to change and innovate in is political structure. I mean, it's amazing how little innovation happens. When you think what's happened in the world in the last 50 years, you've still got the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. You've still got the Electoral College. You've still got the presidential primaries. Nothing changes.
No.
I mean, everything changes in terms of the media and the technology and the message, but there's it's unbelievably conservative.
Yeah.
Constitutional procedure.
Yeah, next to no change, as you mentioned, over the centuries. That's why I wrote a chapter in my Giving the Devil His Due on governing Mars. Just a riff off of one of Elon Musk's tweets about going to Mars, and I asked him, well, what kind of government we're going to have there? And he's like, direct democracy. No rule, almost no rules. I don't like rules. Okay. So that works with 10 people maybe, but if you have 10 million people, how's that going to work? And
just back to something we were saying earlier, I read a Wall Street Journal column about this once. When we do get a message from Alpha Centauri saying, "Hi guys, we're here too," who's in charge of replying?
Right.
Donald Trump?
Yeah.
No, thank you.
No.
Who elected him for us? We're not Americans. The United Nations? God, that's a dispiriting thought. Mr. Xi?
Right. Yeah.
No, thank you. It's quite hard, isn't it?
Don't the SETI scientists...
Who signs the birthday card that we send back?
Right. Isn't there some protocol that the SETI scientists set up for if we receive a message, this is what we should do? Everybody has to be told about it or something like that? I
looked it up, and there'd been a couple of sort of half-hearted meetings to discuss this, but I don't think they'd reached a conclusion.
Right. It would be interesting to know if the extraterrestrials came here and thought, "You're still doing democracy? Oh my God, we got rid of that thousands of years ago. Here's what we're doing now. This is so much better." It's like, innovation in politics. It just seems impossible because half the side, conservatives, they want to conserve the way it was done. As you know, the founding fathers here basically just deified. They got it right. There's nothing to do to improve it.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Unlike everything else in life.
Yeah, no, I mean, it actually amazes me from the outside. The Electoral College has survived not just the 2000 election, but the 2016 election too, where the popular vote went a different way from the Electoral College. That seems to me an extraordinary constitutional issue, and it's amazing that it hasn't resulted in an upset. Yeah,
well, Lessig was just a Harvard law professor was just before the Supreme Court, I think 2 days ago, arguing that the electors should be able to vote whatever they want for president, regardless of what the population of their state or district tells them. based on the popular vote. And the Supreme Court justices were like, well, then what's the point of having a popular vote if the electors can just do whatever they want? So it does seem like the only solution is
Was this the case in which a bathroom was heard to flush in the background?
Oh, I don't know about that. That's funny. Well,
apparently the Supreme Court had an online hearing. And
oh, I see. And somebody heard that. Oh,
somebody could...
We got to turn the microphone off when they went to the loo. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I don't know. That again, those things are almost impossible to change politically. So, well, Matt, I'm going to let you go. Thanks again for writing your book and coming on the show. How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. Congratulations on that. I hope you don't stop writing, because I really enjoy your books, and keep the innovation going for writing.
Well, I'm not as productive as you. What do you do? A book a year or a book every 2 years?
I average every 3 years, but
I'm every 5 years. So
I'm 65 now, so I've accumulated a lot.
How many books have you written, Michael?
13 books.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, you're ahead of me. I think I'm on 9.
A few of those are essay collections, though. 3 of them are essay collections, so that doesn't really count.
I don't think they count. No, so we're not that far apart.
That's right.
If you've got 10 and I've got 9.
Right.
But I think you're going to streak ahead of me. Anyway, your books are fabulous, and I learn a lot from them, and it's great to...
we'll perhaps see you in person, but if not, we'll just stay in touch virtually.
Great to see you, and all the very best.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.